Welcome back to the Holy Post. Reactions to last week's show were pretty strong, so this week we start out with some listener feedback about LGBTQ representation in movies and Al Mohler's defense of conservatism. Then, former president of the SBC Johnny Hunt was removed from ministry for sexual assault, but last week 4 ministry colleagues decided it was time to return him to ministry leadership. What does this say about how disgraced pastors should return to ministry? And have congregational and non-denominational churches just proven incapable of holding leaders that are toxic accountable? Then, a new Twitter scandal offers more proof that Christian nationalism is just a mask for racism and misogyny. After that, I'm joined by Drew Dyck for another round of Drew's Views, where he tells us about new books he's been reading and recommends for us, and he explains why he has a war against fake Christmas trees. Before we jump into the episode, a reminder to our Patreon supporters that there's a brand new episode of Christian Asks. This time, she wonders whether God uses calamities to discipline us. It's a fascinating conversation and a question that a lot of people have. If you're not yet a Patreon supporter, please go to holypost.com and click the Support Us button. It'll give you access to all the archives of Christian Asks, as well as our new series, Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess. Okay, here is episode 538.
Hey there, welcome to the podcast. This is Phil. You're listening to the Holy Post podcast. I'm here with Sky Jatani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, and Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
Caitlin's beaming in from an undisclosed location because she has a privileged arrangement on campus that we cannot tell other people about. So they'll be jealous.
That sounds a lot more dramatic than it actually is.
Oh, it is. It's very dramatic. Sky is in the Death Star, as usual. The Death Star with the prodigal son on the wall. Mm-hmm. Was there a prodigal son painting on the wall of the Death Star anywhere? I don't remember seeing that.
Could Luke Skywalker be considered a prodigal son?
Oh, or Darth Vader.
Or Darth Vader.
Yeah, he kind of came back at the end, came back home.
Right, that's it. Anakin Skywalker's the prodigal son who departed from the Force, the good side, and came back at the very end.
Oh, and then we celebrate him.
Right, there's
year.
That celebration at the end of Return of the Jedi. Remember the Ewoks?
The
That's
Ewok
the same
dance. They're celebrating the return of the prodigal son. Okay, I think we've carried that metaphor about far enough. Now the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
Wait, Caitlin, are you the one? Have you never seen Star Wars, or you've never seen? What have you never seen? You've never seen something big, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter.
I had never seen Lord of the Rings until I watched it because of Sky. We had a bet or a deal.
Okay.
We had a
She
deal.
only watched the first movie.
But I think I've seen like a part of one Star Wars, and it's the one where you think they're in love, but then they're actually related, and that's all I've seen.
Wow.
But that's such a common story in the South, isn't it?
That's terrible.
Okay, I'm going to move right on.
Force ghosts are rolling over in the ether right now because of what you just said.
Force ghost? Okay. Okay, we have to make some corrections. I have to make a big correction because I was wrong. I'm not too big. I'm not too famous. I'm not too popular and wealthy that I cannot say I was wrong. JoJo Siwa did not play the middle child on Full House.
Thank you, Bill. Oh, my word.
That was Jodie Sweetin. But the names, Jodie Sweetin, JoJo Siwa, Jodie Sweetin, JoJo Siwa, they look similar.
JoJo Siwa was not born yet.
I know. I learned that. JoJo Siwa was not born when Full House was on.
When it ended.
I was so wrong. I was completely wrong. Thank you, all 1,200 people that pointed that out to me on social media. I really appreciate it. Caitlin was actually the one who explained it to me last week.
True.
That not only was she not that character on Full House, but she was not born at the time of that character on Full House. And wow, I apologize to everyone. Okay, we got more feedback from last week. We made people angry with us on both sides. Both sides. Yeah, which means we're in the middle, I think. Or we're just idiots in both directions, one or the other. Some people, more conservative than myself, I think, said I misrepresented Al Mohler, said that Al Mohler doesn't care about Christianity. He only cares about conservatism. It's not what I said. What I said about Al Mohler is he wrote a piece in a Christian magazine attacking another thoughtful Christian, not for any concern about Christianity, but because of his concern about conservatism, that conservatism was being elevated to a point where it needed to be defended like we would defend Christianity in a Christian magazine. That was my point. Okay. I think he loves Jesus. I think he loves the Christian faith. I just think he's kind of conflated. And in saying, here's what conservatism stands for, here are the priorities of conservatism, and if you don't support these priorities in the voting booth, you're unfaithful to God. I think you've kind of put yourself in the position of saying, I am speaking for God as to what the priorities are in this election cycle. And that's not good.
Another way of putting it, not to put words in your mouth, Phil, but in a lot of what I hear coming from Al Mohler, it's not that he doesn't express commitment to Jesus and to Christianity. It's that he equates Jesus and Christianity with conservatism. And that all bundled together is what you were pointing out can be problematic.
You think? You think that could be problematic? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm going with. Caitlin, would you like to weigh in to see if you can offend anyone?
I just have one thing to say that is not tangentially related to that, but I do think it's just important to clarify.
Yes.
There's a Christian ethicist, Paul Ramsey, who has a little book where he talks about how he uses the word heresy to describe when a Christian says that a specific policy is the only Christian one, and it's in any case where there are alternatives that have good biblical bases. So he's not saying that it isn't possible for there to be a policy that is the Christian policy. He's saying if you are calling one policy when there are other alternative positions Christians could honestly, genuinely take and still be within the realm of orthodoxy, and you are picking one of those and saying that is the Christian one, you're unnecessarily splicing up the church and you're binding people's consciences in ways that you should not. And he elevates that to a serious enough theological error to call it a heresy. It's not a heresy in the sense that we have formal definitions for heresies, but that's the language that he uses, and I think that's important.
So you're going even further than I went and calling Al Mohler a heretic.
I am not. No. I'm just saying it is not without precedent. Caitlin. It is not without precedent to have strong language for when people unnecessarily equate particular partisan policy decisions with the Christian position to have when there are alternatives that there are good Christian reasons to hold.
All right, I hear you. I totally, okay. So write your letters to Caitlin Schiss at secret location, Duke campus, not to be revealed. Did Sky say, more from last week, from our left flank, did Sky say there should be no LGBTQ representation in movies because it's not profitable? Is that what you said, Sky?
I actually said precisely the opposite. I said there may be very good reasons to have LGBTQ representation in movies beyond profitability, because currently the profitability factor does not seem to be part of it. The movies that have centralized those relationships have not proven to be very profitable. So therefore, you're going to have to find a reason other than profitability to do it. And I said that may well exist. I was simply asking a question. If these movies continue to show a loss financially, what will the studios do?
Yeah.
I wasn't advocating one way or the other what they should do. I happen to know that many studios want to make money. And so I'm curious what that would mean in the future. So an observation about the profitability or lack of it in these movies was not meant to be construed as an advocating for one position or another. I believe in diverse representation in film and media is really valuable and important beyond profitability.
Okay, numerous people pointed out successful shows with very strong LGBTQ storylines like Schitt's Creek on TV, Grayson whatever. I don't remember what that I never watched
Will
it.
and Grace.
Will and Grace. Grayson.
Modern Family.
Modern Family. Movies like Brokeback Mountain, The Birdcage, on and on and on. So here's what I would point out to those people. None of those movies are targeted at children or middle America. They tend to be more urban shows, and their following is more urban. So in other words, those are programs and movies for Whole Foods America, not Cracker Barrel America. Whereas Hallmark Christmas movies are bullseye, entirely targeted at Cracker Barrel Red America and not urban America. Okay.
Can I add two more things to that, Phil?
Yes.
You're right. But secondly, most of those properties you just mentioned, those shows, have multiple straight relationships in them as well. They're not uniquely or entirely centered on the LGBTQ relationship. And that was my point, is we've had diverse representation of sexual minorities for a long time in successful entertainment properties, but these recent movies have centered them, and those are the ones that have not done as well. So A Modern Family or Schitt's Creek has multiple relationships in them, and the fact that some gay relationships are presented is not problematic. I wonder about the centering of them and how successful those can be.
Brokeback Mountain.
And then secondly, like you said, like Bros was a movie that was targeting the LGBTQ community and has done well among that community, but that community is not big enough.
It was not targeting the LGBTQ community. It was betting with its budget and its marketing that mainstream America was ready for a gay-centered rom-com. And mainstream America was not. I would say Strange Worlds, I don't know that the rejection of Strange Worlds, I don't know how much of that to put on having a main character in a family film that was gay, because I didn't even know there was a gay character in that film, and I just thought it looked terrible, and I wasn't interested. And I think a lot of other people just thought the movie looked terrible. Having said that, I meet a lot of conservative people who are involved in the film industry. And they're either making Christian movies, or they're trying to make Christian movies, or they're trying to raise money to make Christian movies. And there has been a ton of chatter in that world in the last year, 18 months, about how Disney has gone off the rails. So, and a lot of that is being amplified by conservative media, by politicians like Ron DeSantis. Like, we can't trust Disney with our kids anymore. So the fact that the last two of their major animated releases didn't do well, Lightyear and Strange Worlds, and the fact that they both had LGBTQ characters in them, which came first? The right-wing media saying steer clear of Disney movies because they have an agenda, or people actually hearing, hey, there's a new movie, but I think it has an agenda. And I'm not sure. So this is interesting. Bob Chapek was the CEO of Disney for the last 3 years, following the very successful and very long reign of Bob Iger. Bob Chapek's 3 years was disastrous. He feuded with the state of Florida and lost them their special status, their tax position in Florida. He offended people inside of Disney and people outside of Disney. They announced, 3 weeks ago, that he was leaving and that Bob Iger was coming back at the age of 72 to try to right the ship. One of the things that, so Bob Iger had an all staff meeting for all of Disney 2 weeks ago. One of the things he said that was interesting and kind of addresses this directly, although vaguely a little bit, is he said, we need to show more respect for our audience. Then he qualified it, because someone then asked, so are we not going to have diverse casts? And he said, no, we're still going to celebrate diversity, but we need to show more respect for our audience. And in that was kind of the statement acknowledging we can't spend $300 million to make and market a family film if half of the, if the majority of the family audience thinks we're out to get them. So we need to acknowledge Cracker Barrel America and acknowledge that even though our staff and our artists are primarily Whole Foods America, we can't tell these stories if they don't play in Cracker Barrel. And that's
didn't he
pickle
say
he's
something
in.
about? Didn't he say something about toning down the culture wars?
Yes. Yeah, he also does it. He thought Bob Chapek handled the Florida situation horribly. And most people have said it never would have happened if he had still been there because he's so diplomatic and knows how to handle situations like that.
Right. And it seems like that's also this whole posture that Iger's trying to take is important for the global market because some of the biggest overseas markets like China are going to be close to you if you have a significant progressive so-called woke agenda. They're not going to buy those movies and properties. So Disney has a global interest in this, not just a Cracker Barrel interest.
Yeah, Disney's in a tough position because they are a blue state company with a blue state artists, creatives, executives who desperately need red state ticket sales and red country sales. Yeah, you need to be able to play in China. China is now the biggest movie market in the world. So that's why no one mentions Taiwan anymore in American movies, because it's a good way to get kicked out of the biggest movie market in the world. And you can't play in the Middle East. So they've debated between doing dual versions of their family films. If you have a gay character or an LGBTQ theme in a family film, just have a different version of it for the Middle East and conservative markets. But then that looks two-faced. So then so right now they're just saying this is a movie that just won't be released in these markets. And these aren't like, outrageous, edgy films, indie films that Miramax would have made. These are like Pixar movies. We're just, this Pixar movie will never get released in Saudi Arabia, and we're just going to have to be okay with that. So it is a tricky time to make movies. Caitlin,
can I say something?
What do you think?
I just am imagining, like, if it was me or my parents or my neighbors listening to this, that might be like, I just don't know why I care, like, about the economics of these movies. And I'm just thinking, I do think there's something really important, happening underneath some of this conversation, which is that, and it relates to what you all said last week about, are we just all going to watch different movies? Like, how far is this polarization going to go to where our worlds are just completely different? I do think some of this about the marketability of some of these films should, instead of leading us to say, oh my gosh, like, there's so huge percentage of our country is just bigoted and hates LGBT people, or for what a lot of times conservatives will look at this and say they have this agenda and they want to indoctrinate our children. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to recognize that, especially when it comes to sexuality issues, because it is so intimate, it deals with people's families, it deals with their children, it deals with deeply held religious or other kind of deeply held beliefs. We have to work really hard at, until given evidence, assuming good intentions on behalf of other people. You might be given evidence that they're homophobic, or you might be given evidence that they really have an agenda, but withholding some of that and saying, actually, a lot of people really just think diversity is a good thing. They're thinking about the kid who watches this movie and says, I'm not alone, I'm not strange, I have a life that could be worth living. And then on the other side, there are people saying, I'm genuinely concerned about my community and my children, and I have really deeply held beliefs about this, and I'm trying to figure out what it looks like to live a faithful life. And some of that percentage of people are homophobic. Some of them, like I said, are trying to navigate this and are legitimately concerned. How they react to that concern, how they express that might not be good, but I think it would really benefit, especially Christian communities. I think increasingly, I'm in a part of the country or a little tiny dot in North Carolina, where there's a lot of actual churches here where when it comes to sexuality issues, we are pretty split. Like, people have a wide range of beliefs about them. I think generationally, that's just going to continue to be true. And I think we will navigate that in our personal lives and our family lives and our church lives better if we look at things like these movies not doing very well and don't assume the worst, or we look at these decisions that studios are making and don't assume the worst and think people on both sides of this have legitimate concerns and reasons for doing it. And we might be given eventually reason to actually think they have really sinister reasons for it. But until we're given those reasons, until they say those things or do those things that make us think they're not good actors, we should assume that we're dealing with just a really difficult thing that deals with intimate, important issues in people's lives.
Well, I nominate Caitlin to work for Bob Iger so that she can help craft his communications about this stuff, because that's exactly what we need. And not just on this issue, but on many, many others.
Yes.
where each side wants to just assume the worst and say the other side is evil or demonic or bigoted or whatever it might be. And we need to ratchet that back. Yeah. And like you said, assume the best until you have some clear evidence to think otherwise.
Yeah. I've complained that it's very hard to talk about abortion intelligently and thoughtfully because both sides have decided the other side are immoral monsters.
Yep.
You know, to hold your position is a sign of depravity. And that's from both sides. You know, either you hate women or you hate babies. Yeah. And there's no
good options.
No middle ground between hating women or hating babies. But this is another
I hate
area.
women babies.
Ooh,
Sky.
okay.
I'm joking.
Somebody's going to take that clip off YouTube. Okay, that's fantastic. But this is another area where, you know, either you're a bigot or you're a groomer. You're a bigot or a groomer.
Literally.
Pick one. That's it. Those are the only choices. And we need to be voices that can hold these things in tension and say, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. And let's understand why someone is so committed to, you know, women's access to reproductive options, or why someone is so committed to taking away this particular kind of reproductive option. So it's hard work, but we need to do it. Okay, a couple of little stories that are a little bit inside baseball. We had a meeting. We talked about at Holy Post how much inside baseball we want to do about evangelicalism. And this is a little inside baseball, but there's something bigger. There's a bigger theme in each one of these. First is the Johnny Hunt story that came about in the last week. Johnny Hunt was the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention who was accused of sexual assault 10 years ago in an incident with another pastor's wife, I believe, a friend's wife. And so was pulled out off his committees and panels and, you know, kind of sent off to pasture. And just in the last 2 weeks, 4 other SBC pastors said, we've reformed him. He's redeemed. He's all better. Back into ministry with him. Everything's good now. And even compared it to finding him on the side of the road, like the Good Samaritan finding the victim on the side of the road. That's one of the pastors said that. And I felt I needed to be the Good Samaritan and not just leave him there on the side of the road.
In other words, Johnny Hunt is the victim in this narrative.
Classic.
So, okay, so now that's discouraging. Would you say that, Caitlin, would you say that's a little discouraging?
I would say that's discouraging, yeah.
Okay, here's the encouraging part. The current president of the SBC, Bart Barber, issued a statement saying, basically, this is bullcrap. He should be disqualified from the pastorate forever.
Permanently, yeah.
Yes. If I had, and this is Bart Barber talking, if I had the authority to do so, I would do so. In the SBC, you don't. There's no real authority in the SBC, so he can't do anything. But for him to take such a bold stand and just, you know, a popular pastor that people, and it's, you know, 4 men, of course, because they're conservative Southern Baptist megachurch pastors, and we vouch for this guy. You know, he might have assaulted a woman 10 years ago, but he's sorry and he'll never do it again. And can he please lead a big ministry again? And to have the new head of the SBC, you know, also a conservative man with a small church in the South, say, no, that's ridiculous. He should, in fact, be disqualified for life. So that was encouraging. Right? Caitlin? Sky? Help me?
I think this story, to take a step back, it raises a bigger question. And Caitlin and I were chatting about this before we were recording about our polity to begin with, meaning church governance. Who has authority to do what with church leaders, pastors, whatever. And this has been a chronic issue for the SBC in recent years and many other Christian denominations that have a congregational polity. So Johnny Hunt, there is no authority structure within the SBC to disqualify him permanently from ministry, because pastors are ordained and established in ministry based on the vote of their own congregation. Mm-hmm. Or in this case, he found 4 friends who have congregations to decide that they were going to claim the authority to restore him to ministry. And it's kind of a free-for-all. But again, it's not just the SBC. There's a lot of other denominations that function this way. And it's becoming clear that there's a lot of really broken stuff out there. And you can find a couple hundred people that are willing to back that up. But here's my question. Why is it that in the SBC or other like-minded, congregational polity denominations, they feel powerless to remove a pastor who has sexually assaulted somebody, or they feel powerless to systematically round up and disqualify anybody who has sexually abused a child? But if you're in the SBC and you're a church that decides to call a woman pastor, they will kick you out of the SBC for that. So on some issues, they do somehow find the ability to discipline cross-denominationally, but on other issues, they don't.
They can disassociate from a church.
Right.
They can't disassociate from a pastor, though, because that's up to the church.
They can't take away his ordination. Yeah.
But you couldn't you say to a Johnny Hunt's church, we are disassociating you from the SBC because you have installed this pastor who committed sexual assault?
Is he back pastoring that church, or is he just doing, I think he's doing like itinerant. Yeah.
Yeah,
okay. Whatever. But
he can speak at conferences again and do important stuff.
Well, you could, these 4 pastors that said he's qualified again, you could say to them, we're disassociating your churches because you are putting someone in ministry who's a wolf.
That sounds like the nuclear option.
Right, but that's my point, is the nuclear option is pulled out when it comes to something like a church ordaining a woman.
Yeah, although they still haven't kicked out Saddleback. There's been calls to kick out Saddleback because they ordained a woman and they're still in the SBC.
That's
Big
true.
Popular church.
I do think part of what Sky and I were talking about earlier before we started recording, there are problems in all kinds of polity, right? You can have the most hierarchical thing. We've seen that with the Catholic Church. Lots of problems with sexual abuse. You can have problems in incredibly low church, free church like SBC churches are. I think part of the problem is I grew up in churches with this kind of polity, and we talked quite proudly about how we would be exempt from the kinds of problems we saw in the Roman Catholic Church because we didn't have that kind of hierarchy. We were protected from abuse because we weren't beholden to a denomination. We didn't have kind of a larger structure above us. And then I witnessed some really horrendous stuff happen in a church. And I talked to my friends who are part of churches and denominations, and they said, well, like, who do you appeal to? That was so blatantly wrong. There's got to be someone who can do something. And there's not, because this is a church that's on its own and it doesn't have. So I just think it's important. This is a good case study in helping us have some humility about the traditions we come from and the kinds of polity we have. And that humility is what's necessary to help us prevent those things, to go, no one should go into any denomination or tradition or specific church and think we have created ourselves in such a way that it's impossible or it's very difficult for any kind of abuse to happen. We should recognize one of the gifts of the Christian tradition, the sinfulness of the human heart. We should recognize that there is a possibility in any kind of church, any kind of tradition for that to happen. And the hubris required to constantly compare ourselves to other traditions and say that couldn't happen here is asking for that thing to happen. It's setting up, actually, ironically enough, it's setting up the conditions for that to happen, because that's so often what happens, right? Oh, he was such an amazing person, I never would have thought, or that I saw that happen other places, that could never happen here. Like, the second you start thinking like that about someone with a lot of power or a church that you belong to, it's a good time to check and say, I'm not asking for cynicism or for you to be overly critical, but just to have the posture of no institution and no individual, is it impossible for them to fall in these kinds of ways?
Right. Guy.
I amen to all that, Caitlin. You're absolutely correct. I do find it interesting, though, that we are living in a moment and culturally where there's such an anti-institutional bias, and we're so scared of the abuse of power in hierarchical systems that there was a recent study that came out that I think non-denominational is now the largest Christian
denomination.
Right. Yes. So people are opting for that low church polity without the accountability. And I'm not saying they're doing it because they think it's immune for the abuses that we've seen in other things. But man, it scares me that there are so many. And I think it attracts unhealthy leadership because where there is no accountability.
Isn't it partly a result that really charismatic men who want to build a following also don't want to have to fit within the constraints of an existing structure because they're entrepreneurs, and this is America and it's free enterprise. So the free enterprise church movement enables really ambitious, charismatic men. I'm trying to think of, maybe Joyce Meyer would be the only example of a woman doing this, to build a huge enterprise, build a huge platform, build a huge following, and not have to get a call from the denominational headquarters saying, we're not sure if if we've approved your budget. And we're attracted to charismatic people that are engaging and fast growing. We love fast growingness because we're Americans, and it's big and it's better, and you can fly people from the ceiling during the Christmas show while they're drumming, and I'm not making that up. But we love that, so we've enabled that because the system, it's a more comfortable place for very ambitious, charismatic leaders.
Yeah,
and
totally.
We like them because if we're with them, we're probably someone they'd be friends with, and that feels pretty cool.
Yeah, but to be fair, and I think we've all seen this, even within denominational structures where there are technically accountabilities in place, even there, very large, very successful, very well-known church leaders are often given an incredibly long leash. The accountability doesn't apply to them the way it does to people in a church of 100 or 200 because they bring in so much money and so much attention and so much gravity to the denomination that they bend the rules for them. And so regardless, wherever you may be, being a celebrity and having a huge audience and generating tons of revenue means you can avoid the accountability that even a system puts in place to avoid to protect the flock. So it's to Caitlin's point, no system is beyond abuse. Okay.
One more story that's a little bit inside baseball, but I think it reflects something that's probably worth following. Christian nationalism might not be a good thing. I'm just
the new direction for us, Phil.
Just follow me here, Caitlin. If you followed the Thomas Accord affair last week. It was about 72 hours that really wrapped up evangelical Twitter in a drama. So, there's a guy named Stephen Wolfe. Stephen Wolfe is a podcaster and an author and a PhD and I don't know something or other, and he wrote what he attempted to be the definitive defense of Christian nationalism, like a 500-page book or 700-page book called a defense, and I think that's what it's called, a defense of Christian, or the case,
isn't it the case for Christian nationalism?
The case for Christian nationalism. So he has a podcast host named Thomas Accord, who is the headmaster of a classical school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where Rod Dreher's children attended and were friends of his, among other conservatives. And someone pointed out, this is fascinating. Okay, follow along at home. Get out your whiteboard, get out your corkboard and your red string and your thumbtacks. Someone pointed out an anonymous Twitter account from 2 years ago that was making very racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic comments and said, I think this is Thomas Accord, the headmaster of this popular Christian classical school. And of course, people were outraged. How can you make such an accusation? And Thomas Accord said, hey, no way. I would never say any of those things. That's not my account. And it kept going and it kept going. And people kept finding more points of reference. Like, look, here's that account posting a picture that was taken inside of Thomas Accord's classical school in an office. He'd be there. And it started picking up momentum. And then about 24 hours later, it was announced that Thomas Accord was stepping down as headmaster of the school. And he had a change of heart and realized, come to think of it, that was my Twitter account. And that was me. Ha, ha, ha. Okay, so he is the podcast co-host with Stephen Wolfe, who wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism. Now, let me just, before we discuss what all this means, it's Kevin DeYoung, Pastor Kevin DeYoung, who's a very conservative and very popular evangelical pastor, wrote a review, very long review, of Stephen Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. Here's how he summarized it. I understand and sympathize with the desire for something like Christian nationalism, but if this book represents the best of that ism, then Christian nationalism isn't the answer the church or our nation needs. For all the fine retrieval work Wolf does in parts of the book, the overall project must be rejected. And then he summarizes the message of the book, and this is kind of stunning. The message that ethnicities shouldn't mix, that heretics can be killed, that violent revolution is already justified, and that what our nation needs is a charismatic Caesar-like leader to raise our consciousness and galvanize the will of the people, may bear resemblance to certain blood and soil nationalisms of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Think?
But it's not a nationalism that honors and represents the name of Christ.
In other words, it's Nazism.
It's not
certain blood and soil nationalist movements of the 19th and 20th century. That's Nazism.
So that's very conservative pastor Kevin DeYoung's summation of Stephen Wolf's book. There's also, I learned a new word in the last 2 weeks, kinism. There are kinists. A kinist is someone who promotes kinism, which is that everyone should favor their own kin, their own kind, their own tribe, their own ethnicity. And it's natural and it's biblical to favor your own ethnicity over other ethnicities.
I thought it was people who follow Sam Kinison.
Oh, that would be good too. But he's dead.
I know.
But what Stephen Wolf says, one of the things he says in his book is different ethnicities really should not attempt to live together. It's just not. We need to keep the ethnicities separate so that cultures can survive, particularly Protestant, Anglo-Protestant Christianity as a culture. As a culture
Shocker.
must survive.
And yet there are people out there going, oh, no. Christian nationalism is not connected to white supremacy at all.
That's getting a little bit harder to say. So it felt like some hoods got pulled off in the last week or two, and we're saying,
some white pointy ones.
Oh, well, I knew that smelled bad. Now I know why.
So my question is, for you, especially Phil, and maybe for Caitlin as a regular co-host on the show, is do either of you have pseudonymous Twitter accounts that I need to be aware of?
I think you should be more worried about Phil than me.
Yes, probably.
I tweet frequently under the pen name Drew Dyck.
Ooh.
That's where I put my funnier thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I don't. It just seems like a terrible idea. It's exactly what
my
Mark
gosh,
Driscoll did when he was jumping on message boards, under a pseudonym.
William Wallace the third or whatever.
Yeah. It's like, really? Really? You don't think, first of all that is inside you. Second of all, you think you can let it out and not have anyone be able to follow it back and figure out it was you.
I actually find it super helpful that these characters are doing that, because it leaves a record of what is inside of them, because what it reveals is that their public persona is a duplicity. It's not really who they are. They're filtering themselves, and they have this outlet where they're unfiltered, and you get to see what's really there. And in that regard, it's kind of helpful that these things come out and we go, yeah, of course, this makes sense now.
Yeah, and now we have people like William Wolf, not related to Stephen Wolf, who is Al Mohler's current intern, criticizing Kevin DeYoung for criticizing the Stephen Wolf book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, saying, I really admire you, Kevin DeYoung. I've loved your work, but you really missed the boat here in not thoughtfully considering the arguments that Stephen Young was making for ethnic separation and Christian nationalism. So it's boy, you don't have to scratch very hard on the Christian nationalism scene before you find segregationists underneath. Okay.
Not
Caitlin, help us.
The only thing I want to say about this is that I don't remember listening to you just now how much you got into this, but there was a lot of Twitter pushback on Accord facing consequences. Like, people raised a bunch of money because he lost his job.
There's a GoFundMe campaign to help
so
Accord.
much money. And I think this relates to the Al Mohler thing in the sense that in a lot of conservative Christian communities, weirdly enough, for all of our emphasis on sin we have a really hard time believing that powerful Christian men should face serious consequences for misconduct, especially when it's misconduct against vulnerable populations, whether it's saying a bunch of racist and sexist and anti-Semitic stuff, or whether it's sexually abusing a woman. We have a pretty low bar for what counts as repentance. And I also just think we have this is especially true when it comes to Mohler, we don't have a good sense of what might be required to live a healthy, flourishing life apart from power and prestige. And so if you were to take from someone their position, their ability to preach, and say, no, for the rest of your life, you have done something so grievous, it is actually better both for you and for the larger community you were a part of, for you to work a kind of, anonymous job and to live a healthy life with your family and to make amends with people you have harmed and to live a quiet, small life for the rest of your life. The fact that that sounds like such a horrible, terrible punishment for someone shows that we have such deeply misplaced priorities. And the same is not entirely true between Johnny Hunt and Accord. You could lose your livelihood and not be able to take care of your family. That's different than losing kind of power and prestige. But I do think in both, we don't have a sense that it might be very good for you to lose some things in this life in order to save your soul, like Jesus talked to. I mean, I literally spent this last week reading a bunch of Augustine's sermons where he talks about it would be better for you to lose the things that you own, to lose your home, to lose your material possessions, and to have those things push you to find God again, to push you towards the church, to push you towards repentance. And that too can be abused, obviously. But I think we have lost a sense that in pursuit of the health of the Christian community, and even in pursuit of the health of the soul of the leader, it might be better for them to lose some material things, some worldly values. And if that seems just unfathomable to us in our own communities, if in your church you're like, the idea that my pastor might do something that would disqualify him from ever preaching again is so unfathomable, that's kind of an indictment on our whole larger way of valuing things and thinking about what's important in life. And that's a good metric, both personally. I say this as someone who loves lots of material things and would not want to lose them, but it's a good way for us to reflect, I think, ourselves in our families and our churches, to think, do these kinds of punishments for really grievous sins seem so outsized to me because they really are outsized, or because I have valued things in the wrong kind of way, and the things that are being rightfully taken away from people are things that I think are more important than they really should be.
To that end, the speed with which so many pastors are quote unquote restored to ministry, I think what that reveals is the idolatry of ministry.
Yep.
That we have made those positions our deities, our gods, our identity, and our value, all of it. And so the attitude is you're ripping away the core identity and life of somebody, and that's too severe a punishment. So we need to restore it as quickly as possible, which is exactly the idolatry that led to the abuse of power in the first place. Yes. And so that's hugely problematic. Going back to the Thomas Accord story, a detail, I don't know if you said this, Phil, but when he first stepped down, Stephen Wolfe said that he was going to give all of the profits from his book for the next month to Thomas Accord, which I don't know how much that could possibly be. And he encouraged other people to raise money, and tens of thousands of dollars came in to support him. And then after, a day or two later, when Accord admitted that the Twitter account was in fact him, I don't know what happened to those donations, or were they given back? Did they grow? I don't know what happened. But then Stephen Wolfe basically issued a statement saying something like, we ought to pray and care for this brother of ours or whatever, who is, again, it's kind of that he's the victim on the side of the road, Good Samaritan story, even though he's the one who spewed the racist, homophobic, misogynistic toxin all over Twitter, but he's the victim. And I don't get this posture of, I would like to believe that if I were caught in some horrific sin, yes, the people closest to me who care deeply about my soul would care for me, perhaps even in a disciplinary way. But to publicly declare, oh, poor Sky, for things that I brought upon myself and hurt others and ignore the people who were hurt. Like, what has to be so warped in our ethics and view of value that we do a 180, Sky, like reverse the tables like that?
Sky, your ministry career is in shambles. We must stop
as it
everything
should be
to help you put back together your ministry career, because that's what Jesus wants.
But that's the idol. We need Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. The idol fell off the wall, and we need all the king's men to put him back together again. And you're not paying attention to the person who got crushed under Humpty Dumpty in the first place.
We have biblical.
Or the fact that it was a stinky, rotten egg.
Yeah.
And we have biblical precedent for this, right? Like Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. David didn't get to build the temple. There are consequences for our actions. And that doesn't mean, when people will kind of lob the cancel culture claim, it doesn't mean that you're no longer, a valuable person, that you can never do anything good again. And especially for Christians, part of the value of believing in eternal redemption, right? Your soul can be saved. You can be redeemed. But that actually gives us a little bit of freedom to say, but sometimes material things are taken from you. And those things should be lessened in importance, because what's not threatened if you are saved is your eternal security. No one is saying that we should make sure that Johnny Hunt is not saved, or that we could somehow do that by kind of condemning him. The same is true for Accord, that I'm glad that we don't have the ability to kind of have any impact on his eternal security. And I'm glad that no matter what he does, he can always turn and receive grace from God. That is a good theological gift. That does not mean that there is not precedent, both in Scripture and all throughout Christian history, of us recognizing that there should be temporal, in this life, material consequences for the decisions that we made.
And I would hope in both these cases, Johnny Hunt and Thomas Accord, that they have dear Christian brothers and maybe sisters who walk alongside them.
How about some sisters?
Seriously.
Yeah, I said that. Brothers and sisters who walk alongside them and care for them and love them and seek what's best for their souls. All that's good. Community is really good. But that's very different than saying they need to be restored to a position of authority. And we could harp about that forever.
Yeah.
And I'm one who doesn't, let me put it this way. I'm not one to say that no one can ever be restored to a place of public ministry. I think it may well be possible, but I think that should be incredibly rare and measured in decades rather than weeks in some of these cases. Yeah. But the fact that it's even on the radar as a conversation point within days or weeks of somebody experiencing a catastrophic implosion like this shows how completely ridiculous and screwed up our systems are.
Yeah. Okay. I had like 3 more stories I wanted to talk about, but we're out of time.
Shocking.
Completely out of time. Shocking! I know. I forget that Sky and Caitlin have things to say too. I always forget.
Keep that in mind.
And then they do, and it throws off the schedule. Well, maybe I should just do these shows solo so I can get through all my stories.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm kidding. That was a joke. That was a joke, everyone who's angrily tweeting at me right now. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. We got some fun stuff coming up. We got a great interview coming up. It's Christmas. Go to the store, theholypost.com, and get a hat for your buddy, or a Crotch Christianity sticker, or a Butt News sticker. Those should be hanging on from the tree this year. Anyway, go check out the fun stuff on the store, and we'll see you next week. Bye. The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you. This episode is also sponsored by Faithful Counseling. If you grew up a conservative Christian like I did, you might have picked up some suspicion of counseling. Isn't prayer all we need, plus a Bible verse or two, preferably cross-stitched and hung on the living room wall? Prayer is fantastic, and cross-stitching is a very relaxing hobby, but I've found the listening ear of a trained counselor extremely helpful when life throws me a curveball, and that's where Faithful Counseling comes in. Faithful Counseling is committed to helping find a therapist that works for you. It's easy and free to change counselors until you find the right fit. Plus, it's more affordable than traditional in-office counseling, and financial aid is available. So keep cross-stitching and keep praying, but also take advantage of a trained Christian professional counselor by visiting faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. They've even got a special offer for Holy Post listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
Just in time for the holidays, I'm joined again by my friend Drew Dyck. He's no stranger to the Holy Post. He's been on many, many times. If you don't know Drew, he's an acquisitions editor at Moody Publishers, and he's my former colleague from Christianity Today. He's the author of numerous books, including Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science. He's working on a new book right now, but he's always reading and engaging in other books really across the spectrum of genres and backgrounds, Christian books, non-Christian books, fiction, non-fiction. And every once in a while, I like to have him on the show to just share what he's reading and give some recommendations. And this week, he's brought 4 of them. Really interesting books. You'll find links and descriptions in the show notes. You might discover one of these books really helpful during the holiday season, or perhaps a gift for somebody on your list. The conversation ranges from theology to history to medicine and science. It's a wide-ranging and sometimes funny conversation, which is why I always enjoy having Drew here. So here's my friend Drew Dyck. Drew Dyck, welcome back to the Holy Post.
It's good to be back, Sky.
Yeah, we're here for another round of your media, book, movie, television selections, which we are now calling Drew's Views.
Drew's Views, that opens it up pretty wide, though.
It
You
does.
want me giving my parenting views, my views of the culture, my views about fake Christmas trees.
Oh, yeah, you came out on Twitter really
I came out
hard
hot.
against
I came out
fake.
hot.
I would think as someone in the Pacific Northwest with perhaps some more environmental leanings, you wouldn't
Ooh,
oppose
I see.
fake Christmas trees.
Nope, this is a stand I had to take. First,
Really?
fake Christmas trees are from the devil. And I'm not saying, like, if you're a Christian, you have a fake Christmas tree. I'm not saying you lose your salvation, but why take chances, right? Yeah, that's where I stand. I don't know. You know what? And this has a deep, I won't get into it. This is weird. This has a history for me. I was like 12, 13 years old when my mom switched from real Christmas trees to fake ones. And we actually had a big fight about it. And not only that, we used to have all this gaudy tinsel. You can see how old I am, but like tinsel and ugly mismatched lights on the tree. And then she went to this fake Christmas tree that was all white, all matching decorations. And I thought it was an abomination. And we got in a big fight about it. There's still bitterness to this day.
Wow. You should see a counselor about that.
I think so. I think you've raised some issues for me here.
Okay. Not that we're getting off on a tangent here or anything, but
Not at all.
when you were 12 or 13 years old, when you were similar in age, like fake Christmas trees were not very well made. They looked like fake Christmas trees. Whereas today, a fake Christmas tree, you know, they've come a long way.
Yeah. I think it's the Jurassic Park thing, though. Like the scientists were so enamored with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Right.
Smell
Okay.
a fake Christmas tree. I rest my case right there.
All right. I'm not even going to have this argument. I don't have a dog in this fight. I
You can tell I'm
respect.
too passionate. My passion is intimidating. I know.
Yeah, I could see this is causing future divisions. Okay, so we're here to talk about some new stuff. You usually bring, have you got 3 for us this week?
I got 4. I don't know if we're
4.
going to get to them. And
Okay.
unfortunately, like there's no like movies or Netflix things. It's all dead trees. If you're watching the video, then you can see them. Oh,
I think this is
too
what's
fast.
coming out now is you hate trees. You just want to kill as many trees as possible. And Christmas
I
is
didn't
like,
even make that connection,
Yeah.
but you might be onto something there.
okay, so you've got some new books out that you've read that you want to recommend to our audience.
Yes.
We have, based on surveys of the Holy Post audience, we are a reading audience. People in our orbit really
love
like
it.
books. We often have authors on here. We have a Holy Post book club, and you always have your eyes open for all the new stuff coming across, Christian books, non-Christian books, and I trust your judgment, except on Christmas trees. What are you recommending?
What do I got? Okay, first one. The title is Beautiful People Don't Just Happen. Good title, huh?
This sounds a little
recognize this
frightening
one?
to me. Is this
Oh,
written
no.
by like Dr. Oz or something?
This is a Christian book, Sky.
It's a Christian, but it sounds
Yeah.
like some kind of plastic surgery advertisement.
Right? I know. And people, if you're watching the video version of this podcast, you might be thinking like, Drew looks beautiful. Did that just happen? No, I've been primping for hours.
I think it's a filter on your camera.
Okay, so no, here's the real thing. Okay, the subtitle will clarify how God redeems regret, hurt, and fear in the making of better humans. And the author is Scott Sauls.
Oh, yeah. I know Scott.
You know Scott? Yeah. He's like I want to say he pastors a church in Tim Keller's universe. Forget the
mean New
exact
York?
name. Yeah, well, or like a Redeemer church.
Okay.
I don't know if there's a connection there or not. Anyway, thought there was. But this is where the title comes from. He explains early in the book. He borrowed the title from the grief expert, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of grief person. And she writes this. She said, the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These people have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. So that's kind of the premise for the book. That's what he takes off on. And he just shares a lot of stories of people who've endured life storms and emerged better on the other side. Some really touching stories, like about a 35-year-old guy who's dying of cancer, about a mom who lost her teenage son to suicide. And actually, that was a particularly beautiful passage in the book, because I remember he says she knew that his life was defined not by that last act, but by Jesus's last act on the cross when he said, "It is finished." I thought that was really cool. Anyway, and so he's just kind of, it's a really beautifully written book, which is appropriate, very pastoral. And it's vulnerable. He shares his own struggles with anxiety and depression, and just makes the point that, man, like when it comes to becoming more like Jesus, growing in holiness, sanctification, whatever you want to call it, often, whether we like it or not, and we probably don't, suffering, hardship, disappointment, loss is all part of that process.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this scripture's clear on this. Trials come into our lives to refine our faith and change our character and make us more like Christ, who endured enormous suffering himself.
Right. I'll take the pain-free path. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I want that one. But
so it sounds like a book about redemption, about God redeeming all things for our good, even those horrible, tragic, painful, terrible things that don't seem to make sense. One of the there's obviously been themes of this nature forever in Christian literature. Some of them fall into the trap of becoming cliche.
Yeah.
Or offering certainty and answers where maybe there aren't any. Does Sauls fall into that trap at all, or does he maintain a level of mystery and humility about this topic that? Yeah, I would hope he does.
He avoids that trap, absolutely, and he's not. Yeah, because we've all seen that or known those people that are like, "Hey, oh, you lost a child? Don't worry, God's going to use this for good."
Right? Yeah. I mean,
cheer up, pal. And it's so insidious because there's a truth in that, right? That God does use things for good, even awful things. But you got to have a little bit of a, emotional intelligence, pastoral sensibility to know what to say when, and he really possesses that. And I think it's from going through a lot of struggles in his own life too that give him that. But at the end of the day, this is a good book for someone who, if you're in a season of suffering or loss or just discouragement, it's really good because it sort of gives you that extra view that says, hey, listen, God's making you into one of these beautiful people right now. And of course, suffering's and he qualifies it by saying suffering's no guarantee that you become a beautiful person. You become embittered and whatever. Yeah. But if you let God use it, you can come through it better on the other side. So yeah, just a really encouraging book.
Years ago, when you and I were at CT together and working at Leadership Journal, I remember some survey that came through that was looking at, they asked people what helped you grow in your faith most, or what was the most formative, transformative part of your experience that grew you in your faith. And almost every survey, it's the same. People identify some painful experience, right? Some loss. And no one wants those things, but there's no doubt they are incredibly formative. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. And as we enter into the holiday season, sometimes those wounds and pains and struggles become more acute. Maybe this is a good book for navigating that time.
Excellent point. Okay, next one. I didn't plan this. This one's a little dark too. Okay, it's not a Christian book. I know. I don't know what's going on here, but it's a fascinating book. The Myth of Normal. And again, not a Christian book, this one. Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. The author is, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Gabor Mate. Sounds like a tea.
A tea from Portland, maybe.
From Portland, absolutely. Yeah. Like yerba mate or something. Anyway, right. Gabor Mate, he is... And I knew about him, and as soon as this book came out, I was like, okay, I need to read this because I read a book he wrote maybe 10 years ago called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he's a doctor. And basically it was this like unflinching record of working with addicts in Vancouver, British Columbia's urban core, right? And he spent, I think, 14 years working with addicts. And basically, this is his big insight about addiction, and it's actually revolutionized the field. Addiction is always rooted in trauma. You know, we have these ideas that we tell kids, like, okay, careful, don't do drugs. If you take one pill, you could be addicted for life, and or that you have a genetic predisposition, which is kind of true, but not really. But his thing is, he discovered as he worked with addicts, every single one of them had major trauma, usually early in life, like in the first few years. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you talk about, like, I don't know, the opioid epidemic or drugs like heroin, they numb emotional pain just as well as physical pain. Right. And so when you're carrying around all that angst and you've got this traumatic past, and even if you're normal, it's just awful, then you take this drug and all of a sudden, oh, what a relief. You feel good for the first time, right?
Yeah. And that applies to non-chemical addictions as well. I mean,
yeah,
there are people who have trauma in their background who self-medicate with food, with work, with ministry.
Amazon.com.
With, all kinds of different things. And they are all ways of coping with some kind of pain or trauma that we don't want to face head on and leads to destructive alternatives. But okay.
100%.
So what's this? The myth of normal. What's his argument in this one?
So what he's talking about here, well, first of all, he starts by talking about American culture of the West as a toxic culture. And he means that almost literally, like he says, like in a scientific lab, if you have a petri dish and you put something in it and it dies, we say that's a toxic culture, right? And so he said, so you look at American culture right now, and he starts citing statistics like 70% of Americans are on one drug, 50% are on two or more. Our rates of anxiety, depression have gone through the roof. Autoimmune disorders have skyrocketed. So he says this is a toxic culture, right? Mm-hmm. So what's going on here? And where the title comes from, the myth of normal, is he's talking about just because something seems normal doesn't mean it's good or that it really is normal, right? Yeah. Even though, a dysfunction and disease is so widespread in our culture to the point where it seems normal and we put Band-Aids on it like medication sometimes, it's not normal. There's something rotten at the base of it. It's a toxic culture. And he's talking about the medical establishment. He's talking about the way we work, the way we raise children. Mm-hmm. That was some fascinating stuff. He talks about his own trauma when he's Canadian, but he's a Hungarian Jew. And he's actually a Holocaust survivor because he was like a baby when the Holocaust was going on. And his mom handed him off as an infant to a neighbor, Christian neighbor, actually, who took him for like 2 months when he was a baby. And he believes that he's had some, I think, alcoholism, depression problems, and just wanting to be like heard and seen more than normal. Is rooted in that trauma of feeling like, because of course he didn't know what was going on. He didn't know his mom's trying to save his life from the Nazis, but he was given away as a young baby. And the message that you receive is that you've been abandoned, that you're not wanted. And so he talks about how so many people have that kind of trauma rooted in their past. And it may not be the kind of trauma we think of like, okay, Vietnam, or, you went to war. But it can be something that maybe didn't seem like a big deal, but will haunt you for the rest of your life. And if you don't get to the bottom of it, it's very damaging. So, yeah. Okay.
So if I can poke at that for a second, not that I like it feels a little bit like you could, how do I say this? If you investigate any person's background, you're going to find trauma.
Right. Especially if you define it very broadly, right? Yeah. Okay. I am going to self-diagnose myself right now and say that I am not an addict. I don't believe I'm an addict. Denial is a powerful thing. It's not just a river in Egypt. I don't believe I'm an addict. And yet I can go back and look at some things in my childhood that were very, very traumatic. Right. Now, if I were an addict, I could go back and point to those very same things and go, oh, that's why I'm an addict. Yep. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So is it a case where it's a self-fulfilling kind of diagnosis because every single human being has some trauma, some pain in their life or in their childhood, and a certain percentage of human beings are going to be addicted to something. So of course we can all look back and go, well, it's because there's a trauma there. Right. Yeah. And trauma is one of those words that's fallen prey to what some people have called word inflation, right? Where it's like someone disagreed with me on Facebook. I've been traumatized. Like, no, you just got your feelings hurt, and that's a little different, right? So, and he talks a little bit about that. And here's another important thing about trauma. It's not actually how dramatic the initial event was. It's how you perceive it. Right. Because people can go to war. Some come home fine. They experience the exact same thing as their buddy, and the buddy is traumatized for life. So it depends on your sensitivity and that kind of thing, too. But I mean, he makes a pretty compelling case, especially for the 0 to 3. And what I get after reading his book, both of them actually, is, my goodness, if people understood how important and how formative 0 to 3 were for children, you would drop everything you could to make sure that your kids are loved, nurtured. He's even a critic of like the, cry it out, harsh kind of method of parenting, because he's like, look at the animal kingdom. You take a calf away from a cow, a baby rat away from its mother, and you see maternal rage, right? And yet, and I got this growing up. I remember, them saying, okay, you just put the kids in a room and you go for a walk and ignore them and stuff. And he said, whenever you're kind of disobeying those maternal or paternal instincts, it's bad news. And he makes a pretty compelling case about that. So yeah, exactly. Not everything is trauma, and he does qualify that. But in his extensive work with addicts, and oh my goodness, you should read the stories. It's not an easy thing to read. These people that are hopelessly addicted to drugs, almost without exception, have brutal trauma in their childhoods. So it's a pretty compelling case. Not to say, of course, if you start taking drugs and you persist for a while, you're going to get addicted, probably like anyone else, right? But that propensity, that proclivity to seek them out and abuse them is something that you're predisposed with if you are imprinted with that trauma early in life.
Right. Well, like I said earlier, trauma, you want comfort, you want soothing, and sometimes a chemical will help do that, whether it's alcohol or a hard drug or something else. And so it's hard to fault somebody who's in pain for seeking an immediate release from that pain. The problem is we find that release, the temporary release, becomes more destructive than the pain itself. So, and then we've had guests on the show before talking about legalization of drugs and other things, and the overall message of we need to stop treating this as primarily a criminal problem and treat it more as a health problem. And that means viewing the roots of this in trauma and pain rather than just criminal activity because of nefarious character, which is a misdiagnosis of the issue.
That's precisely what he says. He says we shouldn't ask why the addiction, we should ask why the pain, right? And get to the bottom of it. And of course, there still has to be consequences. And I think where I live out in the Pacific Northwest, we've seen some of the bad consequences of, unintended consequences of saying, hey, let's legalize every drug and say that being homeless is fine, right? So yeah, there's another side to this, but basically he says that we ignore trauma at our own peril. And his big thing is, and this is some fascinating stuff, he talks about psychosomatic illnesses, which are way more common than we think. And this is a really interesting thing. He talks about how people that are really nice, like really agreeable, just like nice to a fault almost, get sick at way higher levels, especially with autoimmune disorders, to the point where doctors will be like, this person doesn't have ALS. They're too nice. They're not nice enough. Or this person probably has MS. They're really nice.
So what's the connection?
Okay. So his take is that people that are like overly nice, sometimes they have buried a lot of their anger and been raised in contexts where they haven't been able to express themselves. And so it kind of turns inward. Mm-hmm. The good news is, Sky, we're both safe. We're good.
But there's a journey there, and I'll share this. After I graduated from college, I moved back in with my parents temporarily because I was going to go on to graduate school, and I got engaged, and there was a lot of transition going on in my life at that moment. And I was working somewhere, and I was having massive heart palpitations. Like my heart would stop, skip beats. It was really unsettling for, a 23-year-old. And like I said earlier, my dad's a physician. So I called him up and he's like, can you drive to my office? I said, yeah. So I get to his office. He throws me down at the table, shaves my chest, puts all the, leads on me and is looking at my heart rhythms. Yeah, the whole thing. And he was like, you need to go to Dr. Gupta, who's a family friend of ours, who's a cardiologist. So he takes me over to the cardiologist's office, and Dr. Gupta gets me up on the treadmill, and I'm running on the treadmill, and he's watching my thing, and he echocardiogram, all these different things. And finally, after like a couple hours of workup, he makes my dad leave, and he sits down with me and he says to me, are you under stress? And I'm like, no, I'm not under any stress. And he goes, that's your problem. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, tell me what's going on in your life, just matter of factly. And I said, well, I'm engaged. I just graduated. I'm trying to find a job. I'm going to graduate school. I moved back home with my parents. And he goes, that's your problem. He's like, you are under an enormous amount of stress and you are not being honest about the stress you're under, and you're burying it all, and it's coming out through heart palpitations. Other people get ulcers. Some people, they get all kinds of various psychosomatic problems. And ever since then, and like I said, I was 23, I have had seasons of life where when I start getting heart palpitations, I know I am not being honest.
That's your body talking to you.
That's my body talking to me. And I've gotten much better at it. Now I know, I need to express that anger, not necessarily in a destructive way, but I need to be honest that it's there, or whatever the issue might be. So it's been a journey for me to learn to be more honest.
That is really interesting.
With myself and with my community or my family or whoever it is I'm dealing with stuff, rather than burying it, trying to be the good, nice Christian person.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So that's a maturing thing where how do you be honest, but also not be unfairly destructive to the people around you?
Yep. And this is a bigger challenge. Maybe I'll be called a sexist for this. It's actually in the book. He talks about it. Bigger challenge for women. Because for whatever reason, where this comes from, our culture, whatever, women, they have more pressure. They feel more pressure to be nice, to be agreeable.
Sure.
And he talks about how women, as you probably know, have way higher rates of autoimmune disease, for instance, 3 times when it comes to like MS and things like that. And they have higher rates of wanting to kind of make nice and please everyone often. But there is he calls them the shock absorbers of society. Because they take on a lot of that in their body for playing that role often.
So what does he do with the certain percentage of people who have these kinds of diseases who are total a-holes?
Right. And I'm sure they're out there, right?
I'm sure they're out there.
It's a percentage thing though. Like, and it's really interesting. Like you said, like in 1930, for instance, the same amount of men and same amount of women had MS. Today, for every man that has MS, there are 3 women that do. That's just crazy. And a lot of that is probably because, even though things have gotten better as far as equality, at the same time, women have come totally into the workforce. And as you probably know, you've seen the studies, it's pretty depressing. Even when they work full time like their husbands, they still do almost all the work around the house and the care for the children, right? So they've got this like 2 full-time jobs, and it's incredibly taxing. So anyway, the biggest takeaway for me was this. Okay, there's a lot of psyche in the soma, right? There's a lot of psychosomatic diseases, and he says we underestimate how many there are. And he says that Western medicine has kind of bifurcated those things falsely, and we really need to look at people's spirits and souls. And he gets kind of spiritual, and actually he gets into some weird stuff about psychedelics that, whatever. But he... now
we're in the Joe Rogan level of podcasting.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think actually he was I don't know, they had a conversation, I think.
Okay.
But he's a very reputable, respected doctor. Who's saying, listen, we need to break down that wall. And as Christians, I think there's a good thing there. Like we need to be aware that, hey, listen, when you're ministering to someone's spirit, you're ministering to their body as well.
There is a very biblical idea there. I mean, I'm no doctor. I'm no psychologist. I can't, judge the credibility of what he's saying. I'm sure there are people listening to this who are going, oh, that guy's full of crap or whatever. But the basic principle that we need to treat people holistically.
Yes.
Is a profoundly biblical one. You see that in the ministry of Jesus. He doesn't just see them as disincarnate souls. They are embodied creatures, fully embodied people made in God's image that need to be cared for in a fully embodied way. And that's what our families and communities and churches are supposed to do. And I think there's a point that a lot of Western medicine has too often bifurcated body and mind and spirit. But
yep. Yeah, totally. Anyway, so fascinating book. It's a doorstopper. It's like 600 pages.
Ooh.
But he's a great writer and just a fascinating guy with amazing insights. And yeah, again, it'll make you think. One thing, this is really sad. Actually, it's something that was in our tradition, Sky, Christian Missionary Alliance. When I was growing up, missionaries that they'd send to the field, they would mandate that they sent their children away at 4 or 5 years old to boarding schools. For 8 months of the year in a different country. And I've personally seen the fallout of that. Right.
Yeah,
and
there's been a lot
it's all for the
written
gospel.
about it.
Yeah. It's all for the gospel. So you got to do it. Right. but it's been one of those awful things that creates trauma. So that's another thing that I think pastors, Christian leaders have to be aware, like, hey, we got to be aware of trauma and acknowledge that maybe you don't have all the answers. Because I see a lot of well-meaning pastors like, hey, listen, if you're depressed, pray harder. Well, yeah, that's good. You should. Yeah. But sometimes there's more going on. Anyway, great book. And I realize we're probably running out of time. Let's see. I got 2 more, man. Are you ready?
Well, pick the one that you really want to make sure we get to. Well, I'm not promising we're going to do both.
This is like asking me to give up one of my children. No, it's not that dramatic. Okay, here, I'll go in order. This is a beautiful book, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is a novel. A beautiful
Small Things Like These.
Small Things Like These. I think 2020. And this is another dark book. I didn't even plan this, guy.
Have you just been in a Dark Night of the Soul kind of
maybe
season?
Maybe, I don't know. It's pretty gray and rainy out here in the Northwest. Okay. But this is a book about the women and children in Ireland who suffered in what they called the Magdalene laundries, these horrific asylums that were run by the Catholic Church in the 20th century. So what they would do basically is that they would grab these babies or young women that were illegitimate, born out of wedlock, and they would put them in these convents and work them to the bone. It's awful. I mean, doing laundry 12, 14 hours a day. Oh my gosh. Awful. And this is a historical thing. So it's historical fiction. So not exactly a true story, but the context is sadly very true. And the protagonist, Bill Furlong, he's this coal merchant. And he's a family man. And as he is, and I won't give away anything about the plot, but as he's doing his rounds, he goes to the convent to deliver coal, and he encounters the suffering of some of these young girls. And then he doesn't do anything initially, but he has his own history. He was actually born to an unwed mother, so he has some sympathy that other people maybe don't. And so then he has a decision to make, like, is he going to do something about it? And it's scary because the whole town is kind of cowed by the Catholic Church into silence over this. Even though everyone knows it's going on, there are huge consequences for standing up and saying something about it. So it's like I think it won some literary prize. It's just so beautifully written, so deep. And it's so interesting how she teases out his subconscious, like, thinking about this because of his own history and the things that he's doing that he's not even aware of why he's doing it. Very beautiful.
Who's the author?
Claire Keegan, and she's Irish herself. Grew up in Ireland.
That's what I was wondering. Like, there's such a rich, long history of Irish literature that delves into the human experience and soul, right? I don't know what it is about Irish culture that seems to be uniquely... yeah, no doubt. But the literary culture is it's incredibly rich and at illuminating the human experience and often through painful experiences. But it sounds like another addition to that.
And she belongs in that tradition. She's really an incredible writer. So to me, it was interesting though too, right? Because it's intersecting with the themes of religious oppression, showing how it thrives not just off some bad religious leader, but the people who tacitly go along with it, don't say anything, and how it just takes enough silence like that for something to persist.
Well, that has obvious contemporary relevance. But just thinking about the very high profile stories coming out of the SBC in the last year or two, right? I mean,
100%.
As horrible as some of the direct perpetrators of sexual abuse have been, you think about all the people around them that remained silent, covered it up, buried the stories, kicked it down the road, and the Catholic Church did this as well. And it's not unique just to the SBC or Catholic Church either. But you're right; it is the silence of people who don't want to rock the boat that perpetuate these things. And wow,
yeah. So this is a great treatment of that, and it's set in 1985. Interesting. So my father-in-law is Irish. He grew up in Ireland, moved over to the States when he was like 18, 19. So I gave it to him to get his take, and he loved it. But he did say that he thought that by then, he left in the 1970s, but he said by 85, a town wouldn't have been this submissive to the Catholic Church. By then, people were starting to blow the whistle on it. I think she said it that late. There were some of this happening. It was more in the early 20th century. I think she said it that late because that was like the latest it happened, and it's more shocking that way.
Right.
But he said that she captures Ireland really well. Anyway, cool. Excellent book. Highly recommend it.
last one. You got to go
one.
quick.
This is a quick one. This is a quick one. And it's a very practical one. It's not depressing. Okay. 52 Weeks in the Word, a companion for reading through the Bible in a year by Trillian.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I was going to come clean.
I'm already going to call BS.
Okay.
Because if I'm going to read the Bible in a year, I don't want to read another book about reading the Bible in a year.
But that's not what this is.
All right.
This is a companion. Okay. So yeah, I know what you mean. Because like, hey, read this book about how you should read the Bible. It's like, oh, dude, I can just read the Bible.
Right.
This isn't that.
Reading the Bible in a year is an undertaking. That's not
It is. Maybe for you, Sky. I'm a little different than most folks. I read it 5 times in the original languages. But for the rest of you, this is a helpful resource. Okay. And I gotta admit this right off the bat. It's Trillia Newbell. Okay, Trillia. I know you know who Trillia is.
Yeah.
She's the editorial director at Moody, so I'm sucking up to the boss here. But this is her book, and it's excellent. Okay.
So how's it structured? How does this work?
So it's chronological, which I actually kind of like. The other ones I get discombobulated. It's like, okay, read half a Psalm and then read like Matthew 8 and then Exodus. I don't know. Just personally, that throws me off. This is chronological. And then every day she has a little, like a very short, punchy little devotional about the content. And then there's like discussion questions and ideas and a little room to journal your thoughts. So yeah, it's not like something that it's not a ton of reading. I mean, you can read each day's reading in the book, like the devotional, in 3 minutes, right? And then the lion's share of the time you can spend reading the Bible. And she even says like, hey, take a break today. That's not unspiritual. Reading the Bible's hard, right? So you need breaks once in a while. So it's just a good resource for people that want to tackle that perennial goal of reading through the Bible in 1 year.
Well, this is the right time to think about that with the new year a couple weeks away. Right? Great goal for 2023.
I planned that, Sky.
Totally. Well, you've covered the waterfront pretty well here. That is right. It's practical. It's a New Year's resolution kind of guide, a helpful book. You've given us a book about, what's it called? Beautiful People Do Not Just Happen. Right?
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, the thing I have to say about Scott Sauls that I love is he's bald. Okay. So if I'm going to hear about suffering from someone, I don't want to hear it from some 25-year-old with a full head of hair. I want to know that the author suffered, that he's lost something.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You see me.
Oh, you see me.
I feel very seen.
You see me?
Well, you know what, Drew? If I had as much hair left as you do right now.
You should see me in the shower, Sky.
No, I really shouldn't. Really shouldn't.
Okay, I just want to say goodbye. This is probably my last appearance on the Holy Post.
Okay, no, I'm trying to wrap this up here.
Sorry.
You've given us a good, practical New Year's resolution kind of book with the True Bell, read the Bible 52-week thing. You've given us one to help us rethink suffering and struggle with the Beautiful People Do Not Just Happen. You've given us a real thinky piece on there's the myth of normal. Right. And all this medical, psychological addiction stuff. And you've given us a novel that takes us into the
multiple
horrors
genres, baby.
of the Catholic Church in 1980s Ireland. That's, something for everybody. Maybe you'll get one of these in your Christmas stocking. Wouldn't that be thrilling to, open up your Christmas presents and discover a book about the abuses of Catholic nuns?
Don't give it to your kids. They might be disappointed.
That's right. Well, Drew, appreciate you. Appreciate the fact that you read so broadly and bring us your best views, Drew's views. Gotta be careful. We're not going to go back to the old titles.
Never.
And do you have any special plans for the holidays?
I'm sitting on my butt in my house, which is awesome. Because like in past years, we've traveled and then it's like great, but it's stressful. And so I'm looking forward just to laying low.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere either. We're laying low. It's a good thing.
It is.
All right, Drew. Till next time. Thanks so much.
Adios.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.